Hello, welcome back to another webinar day with Charity Digital. To those of you who've joined us before, it's great to have you back. And to our first time listeners, we hope today's session will be the first of many with the Charity Digital community. Wherever you're joining us from today, we hope you're managing to stay cool and are taking on plenty of fluids and staying hydrated. It is scorcher out there. For our newcomers, here's a quick update of who we are and what we do. Charity Digital is a charity that helps organizations accelerate their impact using digital technology. And we do this through a number of services. We have Charity Digital News, which is a media platform where organizations can access the latest digital news, insights, and resources. We have Charity Digital Exchange, which is the UK's only discounted and donated technology platform that has saved charities almost £240 million in software and hardware costs. We also have our Charity Digital Jobs platform, which is a job board that connects charities to the best digital recruits looking for their next role. We have our Charity Digital Mail product as well, which is our white labeled email marketing platform that combats the pain points of platforms like MailChimp and others. And finally, we have our Charity Digital Payments, which is a tailored payment processing solution for charities. Today's webinar explores how charities of all sizes can turn their online support into a thriving community that can really help them amplify their message and drive their impact online. We're delighted to bring back Teresa from Social Media Gurus Lightful to share some key insights on why you should spend time on your biggest online fans and build a community of high quality supporters who will help you grow your digital presence. But before we get started, just want to do a quick reminder that we'll be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So make sure you stick around for that. If you want to ask a question, you can do so at any time by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if we happen to run out of time before your question is asked, don't worry. We like to record all additional questions after the webinar finishes. And we'll include those in the resources and record via email in a week or so's time. So that's enough for me for now. I'd like to hand you over to Teresa and welcome back.
Hi,
Teresa,
Chris.
it's great to have you back.
Good to be back. My name is Teresa Litza. I'm a social media manager and trainer at Lightful, and it's really great to do another webinar with Charity Digital. Today, we're talking about building an online community, how to get started, how to really define a social media community, and then sharing some tips on improving the engagement, focusing on safeguarding, and busting some myths and common questions around community building. First of all, when we're talking about social media communities, it's good to start from the very beginning. Why do we want to use social media in order to build a community? When thinking of the power of social media, it's good to remember that it's where our supporters are. They're using these channels on a day-to-day basis, and we want to make sure that we reach them exactly where they want to be reached. It's a great way to find new advocates, to build long-lasting relationships, and you can also share your story, which is a great opportunity to try different content and different ideas. First of all, we're starting with a definition. What is a social media community? When we're talking about a social media community, we pretty much mean the people who follow you on social media and want to find out more about your work even more. So when we're talking about a community, they are the people who have shared experience, interests that they might be inspired by your work, and chances are they might be donating or supporting your campaigns. And when we're also mentioning social media community, it's good to mention from the beginning that it could be your social media community as a whole, so every single channel that you have online, or it could be a very specific community that is very niche and focusing on one channel. It could be, for example, an Instagram community that might be very engaging and vibrant, or it might be just a Facebook page or a Facebook group. So we don't necessarily need to have a definition that is focusing on one channel or all channels. It really depends on how you're really using social media. And another thing that you might have noticed when it comes to social media communities is that they can be quite different. There are private communities and also public communities. The public communities is when you have, for example, a Facebook page or an Instagram profile. But what's also really trending, especially the last few years, is the idea of the private communities. This is, for example, a Facebook group, something that might be closed and not everyone is having access to that. But this doesn't necessarily mean that it's not engaging or that it's not a really vibrant community. So why should we consider the idea of building a social media community? There are many different ways to consider that and explore the benefits, and some of them could be to find your most loyal supporters. to find those who are following you and try to engage them in a more personal and impactful way, or to try to streamline the communication between different groups of people, bring them together, find out more about them, and try to engage with them. Another way is to just make the most of your social media presence, just to make more specific goals and objectives. Or it might be also useful to understand your supporters. Those are the ones that actually visit your site, your campaigns, or they might turn into your donors. So any learnings, any insights that you can find from them can be very valuable. And you can also recruit volunteers, which is always a great case. You can promote your events and create very specific communities. And then you can use those engaged supporters to actually involve them in your future plans. So there are definitely many aspects to consider when building a community, and it really depends on how you want to make the most of it. And we've just mentioned the objectives and how you really want to make the most of the community. So some ideas when thinking of building a social media community and what you want to make the most out of it. It could be around awareness, when you want to make sure that more people find out about your organization. So they might be new, they might not necessarily know many things about you. So you want to make sure that they become more engaged. Then you might want to focus for engagement. You do have a number of people following you and you want to find those who are more interested in engaging on a regular basis with you. Or you might want to focus more on fundraising. So that means trying to combine the social media aspect with more concrete conversion in terms of fundraising. And then you might want to make it more general. You might want to focus on volunteering, bringing the volunteers together and trying to keep them engaged. Or maybe around campaigning, when you want to be an advocate of a very important topic, try to keep everyone aware and keep them interested in the next steps. And when it comes to service users, it's also a great idea to build a community and try to find more about them and find different ways to actually support them. So as you can see, the objectives can be very different. You don't necessarily need to have only one objective, but it's definitely useful when starting on social media and the idea of a community to have a think of this and what would make more sense for your organization and your social media presence. So how can you get started? We're talking about community building. You might not have created one up to now, or you just need some help to take it to the next level. Something that you should definitely keep in mind, and sometimes we tend to forget that, is that you really want to make sure that your social media community doesn't just stay on your social media channels. You want to make sure that someone who's visiting your site or your email newsletter, they have an idea of your other channels and communities that they can be a part of. This is an example from Time to Change, and they wanted to make sure that when they're sending an email newsletter, that if you want to find more details, you can just follow them and be part of the community. This way, it's also easier when you just start with a community to make sure that more people find out about this. If someone's not following you, for example, on Facebook, but they do receive your newsletter, it might be a great way to make sure that you promote it. So how can you build a community? Some tips to consider. First of all, I'd say research on the best channels that you want to reach your audience. This might be, for example, the channel that you're using right now. If you're using Facebook, then you want to start thinking, how can you build a community on Facebook? If you feel that Instagram might be the right channel because more people are now spending time on it, then you want to say that I'd like to spend more time on Instagram rather than using my time on many different channels. Then you want to start thinking, why should someone join your community? Have a think of the content and how you can really make sure that you keep everyone interested. So you can come up with a plan. It doesn't have to be something strategic or time consuming, but just try to write down some content ideas and what would make it interesting for someone to be part of your community. And I've just mentioned Time to Change. This is an example because I really like the idea of connecting the channels. This is part of their website when they're talking about change makers, the people who are actually making change for their organization. So what's interesting is that you can just have a look at their website and see the recent tweets. This is a great way to highlight your community, to connect your social media channels, but also to highlight them on the site because many people would access your website and they might not necessarily follow you on social media yet. So it's definitely a good idea to connect different channels online and sometimes offline, just to make sure that everyone is aware of all the different channels. So when we're talking about the first steps of building a community, it's really good to keep this in mind. You want to make sure that you're aiming for loyalty. Someone wants to join the community, and ideally you want to keep them interested. You want to make sure that you add value, that you do give someone a reason to join the community. And it's also important to aim for consistency. This is on your side, and making sure that you don't create, for example, a Facebook group and you just forget to update it for 6 months. And of course, you want to make it inclusive. You want to make it a safe space. Everyone should feel welcome. And the idea of the community is that it's not about you, it's about the people who actually form the community. So it's always important to keep that in mind with every content that you actually create. So how can you grow your community? What's the next step towards making sure that it's successful? As we've mentioned earlier, it's really important to find the right channel. You want to focus on the key channels that could actually make it more successful and effective, and also to make the most of your time. You don't want to have too many channels because it might be confusing and overwhelming sometimes in terms of focusing on the right channel. Have a look at your current social media channels, the ones that might be working better, and see where the engagement is at a better rate right now to see whether the community is actually more feasible. If you feel that you don't really have a big social media presence right now, or you're still new, then I'd say start from the channels that work better for other organizations. For example, you might want to start with a Facebook group and a Facebook page, or you might want to experiment with Instagram or Twitter. So look at other organizations, especially those who might be similar to your cause, and get some ideas and try to find a creative aspect that works for your organization. So when it comes to tips on growing your community, you definitely need to start small and set realistic expectations. You don't want to aim for something very ambitious because especially in the beginning, you need some time in order to get the community growing. You want to be genuinely engaging, and sometimes it's good to think like yourself, not just the organization. What would others enjoy seeing, and how can you have some sort of plan in mind for the content? And of course, when we're talking about a community, you want to encourage a conversation, maybe to ask questions and try to be genuinely engaging again, because you want to be authentic. You want people to really enjoy the idea of being part of this community in a way that they will really feel inspired to actually take any action that you might want in the future. Another thing to consider when we're talking about building the community and making sure that we align the goals that we've set in the beginning is to measure the growth. And this is really important to mention that it's not always about the followers. Sometimes we tend to focus on social media on the number of followers just to define the success. But this is really changing, and it's not really the best way to measure success nowadays. So it's probably better to focus on engagement, on the participation, for example, you might be having, or the number of comments, maybe the interest in someone supporting your next campaigns, for example, the number of shares, those who are really eager to continue the conversation and support your content. And of course, there might be further benefits, for example, supporters who want to become volunteers, or the supporters who want to be part of your next campaigns and be your ambassadors. And of course, ideally, even to find new donors. So there are many ways to measure the growth. It doesn't necessarily have to be one measurement, and you don't also want to make it very complicated. Find what's your main goal and how you can really make the most of your community. We've talked about engagement quite a lot already, and it's usually one of the common questions when we're talking about a community. So how can you improve the engagement of a social media community? When talking about engagement and the challenges in actually increasing it, I'd say the first step is to set up an engagement plan. And that sounds quite strategic and complicated, but it's not really. It's more about thinking, what would your supporters like to see? Come up with some questions, some posts that you want to share from time to time, those that are more authentic and more engaging. Maybe something that's quite casual, but still talking about your organization and your cause. It's really important to keep the conversation going. For example, if someone replies to a post, you want to make sure that you do reply back, not necessarily in a minute, but you want to make sure that you acknowledge the participation and that you really encourage everyone to feel that they could just share a post on their own. And last but not least, sometimes the moderator is also the cheerleader. It's not always easy. It can definitely be challenging, but it's really important, for example, in a Facebook group or a closed community, to be able to encourage your supporters to actually feel more excited, more inspired, more motivated. So you want to make sure that some posts are definitely towards that direction. It might be something casual. It might be a GIF just to say, "Happy Friday, everyone. How's everyone feeling?" Or if it's a warm day like today, just to share a post and say, "Hope you all feel safe and drink more water." And it's just the everyday moments sometimes that make someone feel more appreciated. So definitely don't underestimate this. And you might have noticed it's quite common when we're talking about engagement to ask questions, because it's a really direct way to be more engaging, and it tends to work quite well. I really like the example from Girl Scouts because they wanted to be more engaging, to have more comments, but they also try to make that idea of engagement into an image that is quite simple. So it's sort of like a fill in the gap sentence. So they just ask something, and as you can see, the number of comments was quite impressive. So it's more about thinking of different ways to be engaging. You don't necessarily need new images all the time, but even some simple posts that are quite engaging and conversational can really work well. And something that we'll also mention later, Instagram stories can be great in improving engagement. They work really well, and it's really great the fact that you can just spend 1 minute on your phone to ask something, ask a question, have a quiz, and come closer to your supporters to hear what they're talking about and what they'd really like to have from you. So this is just an example from NSPCC, but there are many stories from different organizations who are really making the most of Instagram lately. And now it's all about safeguarding, and I think it's a very important topic because when we're talking about an online community, especially for a charity, it's very important to make sure that you do have some rules and monitoring in place to keep the community safe, and of course to protect your work and make sure that there's no negativity or angry and spam comments. So in order to keep the community safe, you want to have a safe space, you want it to be inclusive, and of course, ideally, you don't want any spammers or trolls or anyone disrupting the idea of the community. So whether it's a public or a private community, you want to make sure that you do have some ideas in mind on how to have some monitoring in place to keep everyone feeling safe and included. This is an example from Facebook groups, and I really like this idea from Facebook. They want to make sure that when you create a group, even when it's private, that there are some rules in place to make sure that you keep the community in a good place. And sometimes we're wondering what kind of rules do we want to create. So luckily, Facebook created some templates. If you're not sure what you want to have there as a rule, they just have some ideas. They're right there, you just add them, and they're quite good because it's a good starting place. And of course, you can add your own. And another thing that I really like on Facebook groups are the vetting questions for someone to join your group. So if you want to keep it specific, for example, your Facebook group on the service users, you want to make sure that you won't have others who have nothing to do with your organization and might disrupt the conversation. So you could create a question for someone who wants to join. For example, how did you hear about us? Why would you like to join the community? What can you contribute? And this way it's easier to tell if someone really wants to join or if it's like a possible disruption. This is an example of what the rules look like on Facebook. And these are the rules that are there as a template. And as you can see, there's also a guide. If you want to find out more, you can read on the different ways to monitor your community and make sure you keep it safe. If you do have a Facebook group, I definitely recommend that. I found that very useful, especially when I was starting with Facebook groups. And this was pretty much how I tried the idea of creating a community for Facebook groups and setting up some rules. We wanted to create a space, sort of like a community for Lightful for the people who are interested in our organization, our platform, or simply our webinars. So we built a Facebook group because we felt that a Facebook page is too general. So we wanted people who are actually interested in asking questions, in talking about social media or anything similar. So we built a Facebook group and we want to make sure that there isn't disruption or someone who's not interested in that. So we added those rules. I had a look at the templates. I made it really easy. And I've also included the question, how did you hear about us and why do you want to join the Lightful community? The first question is very useful because it gives you a good idea of how can someone find about you. It's useful because you realize, oh, people from webinars are really interested in the community, or maybe someone from Twitter find out about this. And of course, the question, why do you want to join the community, is very important because this way you can tell if someone's really interested in joining. And now it's time for myth busting and answering some frequent questions. And of course, I'm waiting for the Q&A in the end to answer more questions from your side. You might have heard when we're talking about social media and social media communities, why should I actually focus more on social media? It's very time consuming. I have so many things to do that it's just another thing on my list. Well, if you're actually interested in forming a social media community, I'd say here are some solutions for that. Maybe start with have a posting and engagement plan. Instead of spending every single day to keeping the posts and the community going, spend, let's say, an hour every Monday and say, I'm going to schedule some posts, and then on Wednesday, I'll just have a look if there are any comments. Then start observing the time that you're spending. How long does it take for you to create the content, and how can you make the most of your time? And as we mentioned earlier, focus on the best performing channels. You don't necessarily need to have too many social media channels because this tends to be overwhelming and not as successful. And another idea is to be more transparent with your team. Someone might be able to help, or you might want to get ideas in terms of content from other people. So definitely don't underestimate that. Another common question, why should I have a social media community? I don't see a real and clear value on it. The first answer to this is you need to have clear expectations. It can be true that if you don't have clear expectations in the beginning, you just create, for example, a Facebook page, a Twitter account, and then you're not really sure what you're getting out of this. You want to make sure that you communicate the goals with the rest of the team and the stakeholders, because as we know, sometimes not everyone is convinced on the value of social media. So you want to make sure that you share some updates, you keep everyone up to date with the progress, or if something's really interesting or a nice mention is happening, you want to find that link between the social media community and more tangible goals. It could be fundraising, could be traffic to the site, or even finding new volunteers who want to support you. Any of these could still be clear value. Another thing that you might be wondering, why should I create a community on social media? It's really hard to manage this and monitor all the updates. That's definitely true. It could be overwhelming if you felt that I need to reply on every message in 5 minutes, but you actually don't need to do that. You don't need to feel that you set really high expectations. You could allocate 30 minutes a day or every other day just to have a quick look on your social media channels. And in terms of monitoring, it's definitely good to set up some rules. What makes a negative or a spam comment? When should I interfere? Or why should I make sure that I keep the community safe? There are also many online tools that help you create mention alerts. One of them is Google Alerts. It's really easy and it's free. So if someone's mentioning your organization, you just get notified and you can just straight jump in and reply. And something that we also hear quite often when working with charities, why should I focus more on social media? I've tried, but I don't really see an increase in followers the last few months. I think that goes back to the idea of what we mentioned earlier in terms of the measurement. It's not necessarily about the increase in followers. Of course, that's still important, but it shouldn't be the priority, because especially when we're talking about community and building a really engaged community, you want to make sure that engagement is your priority. It's better to have, for example, 100 people who really believe in your organization, that they really support you, that they're always the one to spread the word, rather than just having 500 followers who never engage with you, who would never be willing to support you, or who don't really follow your posts. So definitely don't follow on the number of followers, especially as a main priority. And try to connect again your community with other aspects, those who might be volunteers, advocates, fundraisers, and try to find the link that you can communicate with everyone, that it's not just about the number of followers. And a couple of trends to consider, and we've talked a bit about them, but it's definitely useful in terms of community building. Facebook groups have had increased exposure in terms of Facebook on their own. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg talked, I think it was a few months ago, on the future of Facebook and how groups will be more important at some point rather than pages, because people tend to spend more time on private spaces nowadays than just a page. So if you want to focus on building more engaged communities, an idea is to start experimenting with Facebook groups. There could be different uses of groups, for example, for service users, for campaigners, for volunteers, or even for local communities. And you might notice that there is a better engagement this way that rather than just relying on your Facebook page, for example. And something similar is the focus on one-on-one communication in terms of social media. The idea of WhatsApp being on the rise and Messenger and similar channels. It's good because you start realizing that you can reach every single person through a page. You want to make sure that you narrow down your groups and the idea of communities. And sometimes this can be even more effective than talking to every single person. And Instagram stories, we've mentioned them earlier. Instagram is probably the most engaging social media platform right now, and more charities are trying it lately. But especially with stories, the good thing is that you don't necessarily need to spend too much time. They could be very engaging and you can try different ideas. As we've said, questions, answers, and anything that might be useful, for example, just a casual quiz, asking your supporters what they think about something that you're preparing, or even going behind the scenes when you're running an event, a fundraising activity, or letting your volunteers take over. So there are many ideas and not necessarily requiring big budget and resources. You just use your phone and you try out to see what's working because it only lasts for 24 hours. So it's not a big deal to give it a try. And just a recap from everything that we've discussed before we open up to the questions. Remember that not all your followers form your community. When we're talking about a social media community, we don't mention every single follower, but it's more about those who are more engaged. And that's why you need an engagement plan, some ideas or questions to keep the conversation going. And you want to make sure that your supporters feel involved, that this community is not just about your organization, it's about all your supporters coming together and feeling that they are actually part of this community. And it's good to be consistent. Again, have these ideas in mind that could keep the conversation going. Help your supporters feel involved and empowered in order to ask their own questions, add their own comments. And it's definitely a good idea to set up some rules to keep the community safe. It will definitely be good to do that in the beginning because it will definitely save you time. And I've mentioned Lightful earlier in case you want to find out more, or even the Lightful community if you want to. The Lightful platform is a social media platform if you want to schedule posts just to make sure that Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn are in place to save time. Feel free to give it a try. It's also free, and we're happy to answer more questions around that anytime. And now it's time for questions. I'd like to hear what everyone thinks.
Well,
I wasn't checking the comments, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Teresa. That was really, really good step-by-step insight how, you know, a charity of any size can go from, you know, beginning to end and build that community on the way. I think one of the things that particularly resonated with me was that focus on quality over quantity. Yeah. And it's like the old management adage, you know, the 80-20 rule, where 20% of your followers will do 80% of your work. If you've got them in the right place, if you're using the right channels, and if you're asking the right questions and doing the right things from an engagement point of view. So I think that's one of my key takeaways. But let's dive into some questions.
Yeah, of course.
As usual, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so by hitting the Q&A button that's on the footer bar there. See, we've got a few coming already. First of all, from anonymous attendee, how can I pick the right channels for my community?
Good question. I think we've briefly mentioned that. It's usually the starting point on thinking of your current social media channels. If you do have a social media presence, for example, on Facebook, you're saying, I want to make sure that I do form a community over there. And if you don't have any social media presence, maybe look at other organizations, find some sort of inspiration. or even look at the latest trends, what we discussed. For example, Instagram is growing quite well. If you feel that your supporters are using that channel, then maybe you should give it a try.
Great. I quite like this next question because we get some of this as well in some of our groups and communities, and even some of the ads we put out there. What's the best way to avoid the spammers and
That's
the
always
negative
a great question,
comments?
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always a challenge because you can really hide every single negative or spam comment. You can really avoid it sometimes. Yeah. But I'd say what's important is not to be afraid to actually be out there, because we've heard many cases that are quite valid from small charities who feel afraid to actually be active on social because they're really afraid of the trolls. So I think in this case, it's good to be able to allocate even half an hour a day to keep an eye on what's happening. Obviously have some sort of rules in mind of what would you consider, for example, really negative, and what would you consider a comment that you really want to hide. Or if you want to be quite open to anyone's idea, when is the time to actually interfere? There are many resources online. We'll be happy to share in the follow-up on some guidelines and how other organizations have approached their monitoring and crisis comms. I think that might be interesting.
Yeah, we have our own set of rules around that sort of things on. I think it is quite important to think of when you're putting it, whatever you're putting out there on social media, and you kind of open everything. It's that question between freedom of speech versus
it's more about
protecting
finding the
your
balance
organization.
Sometimes.
Exactly, and I mean we generally go for anything that's particularly demeaning or profanity based. Exactly. We'll get rid of that. But if someone's expressing an opinion in a well-mannered way, and that's also information for us. If it's a negative, that's about an ad or about it's a metric. Okay, you can bring it back to sentiment, for example. And if something's being talked about in a negative way, it probably means that you need to reconsider that, for example. So I think there is a positive side to the spammers and the negative comments as well. It's like all news is news type of thing. Moving on. So the next question here. Have you got any tips for how to subtly encourage members of our online communities to do a little bit more? I think this is a good question as well. There's a lot of people who will just like and retweet. How can you get them to take that next step?
I think it sometimes depends on the way you're framing the question, or think more the copy. For example, if you just share something about your organization on inspiring them, you're just sharing something that that this is something someone retweets, but it's not something that they would add to that. Or if you ask a question, something that's very direct, that this way you're just expecting the comments. And if you feel that I just don't want to be the same person posting all the time, for example, in a Facebook group, I'd say it's really important to have at least another person in your organization or someone that who might be good to just keep the conversation going. Instead of just saying the same name over and over posting, just have some help on that. It's definitely useful.
Yeah, it's like seeing somebody else interacting, like hearing a few different voices, for example, as well. Great. We have a couple of questions here from Nikki. I know we went over social media rules before. Do you have any examples of social media rules? It might be a good idea to showcase some of those Lightful ones that you showed a little bit earlier. And
I think it was really useful. I've had a look when I wanted to make sure I create such rules, to look at other channels and groups. You might be at a personal level member of a group, or just do it for your own research, because most Facebook groups, especially if they reach a number of members, at least 100 members, they always set some rules, and it's really interesting to get some ideas on that.
Yeah, great. It's a really good example. And she follows that up with how do you communicate those rules? I know they come up when you join, right, on Facebook.
Sometimes you can just mark it as an announcement, so it shows up at the top of your Facebook group. Or if someone violates some sort of rules, you want to just politely remind them, just so this is not really adhering to the rules. I'll have to delete your comment, but just have a look if you want to have more questions.
Great. Next question from Michael. You mentioned Instagram stories a bit in this webinar. Do you think it hinders charities who don't have 10,000 followers or verified that the swipe up option isn't available? Particularly as you kind of direct supporters to your website somewhere to sign up in an event. So what is your friend who's
that's always the challenge with Instagram, isn't it? It's not easy for anyone to have 10,000 followers, and not many charities have 10,000 followers. So I think it's not obviously the main channel on Instagram because exactly you can direct people to your site all the time. But in terms of community building and engagement, it's definitely a good option. So maybe you could combine that with another channel, whether that's on social media or even beyond social media. But yeah, again, in terms of the engagement, especially Instagram stories, when you just want to ask a question, have someone's opinion, it's a really direct way. And more people are using stories. So it's a good experiment.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's like we kind of spoke about before. It's a testing environment as well. And I think you have to, like, some really good advice is to go out there and try things and try them in different ways and see what results you get. And that'll help inform decisions and how you use certain channels and what for as well. Next question for Siobhan. Do you have any tips for how best to produce engagement in a partnership project across multiple organizations, rather than an individual charity organization?
That's a great question. And I think when you're thinking of the partnerships, it's actually a great place to be because you have more than one organization being part of that. So that could be probably easier when you just talk with the other organizations, maybe exchange an email and say, we're going to post these things. Would you like to also keep the conversation going? So it's like having a cross plan in mind in order to make sure that everyone is a part of that. And obviously the audiences of every single organization.
Great. Actually, quite a relevant question from Kylie. We've already taken the steps previously mentioned. How important is it to keep experimenting with different content to keep our existing community engaged?
Oh, I love this question. I personally love experimenting with content, but it's definitely not something that you want to do every single day. I think it's usually good to be able to try something out and then allow some time to see how it goes and then decide if it's the right time to keep that, for example, after a month, depends on the experiment, of course, to give it some time to see how it goes and then to see if you're keeping that to your schedule or you're changing it. But in general, I'd say it's good to try out different ideas, especially if you have the time. And the way social media is changing quite fast, it's good to try to be ahead of the curve, at least as much as possible.
Totally. Next question from Hannah. My organization's engagement on Facebook and Instagram is really good. However, we are below average on Twitter. Can you suggest anything specific to Twitter to help increase their engagement?
First of all, it's really good that you have great engagement on Facebook and Instagram, especially Facebook. It's quite a challenge lately, so that's really good. I'd say if you really want to keep Twitter growing in the engagement, and again, it comes to the question of the time that you have and the regions that you want to grow Twitter. The good thing with Twitter is that it's very conversational. For example, you can be more casual, you can ask more questions, you can have it as a way to be more involved with your supporters, to try to keep an eye on the conversations or the comments that they're having on you and answer in a more personal and authentic way. Or you could use it as part of events just to share more often or engage with others in the sector. I love, for example, using Twitter in a personal way just to keep in touch with everyone in the sector. And I use that also for Lightful because you just see a nice conference that you're not part of that and you want to engage with those who were there. So I think it's good to keep an eye on the awareness days, anything that's trending, and just find new opportunities to jump on a conversation.
Yeah, great. And then I think, personalization is key to that.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you want to learn a bit more about that, we did a webinar with you guys recently about personalization. Yes. So you can find that on our website. Reese actually has a very similar sort of phrase question, and I know we've talked about Instagram already. You say that they've got another strong Facebook group following and engagement, but wants to know how they can use Instagram a little bit more. I know we touched on that briefly, but I wonder if you have a bit more of it.
If you've just created, for example, the Instagram account or it's still growing, it might be a good idea to mention that and promote it through your other channels. It could be your social media channels like Facebook, involve it in your newsletters, or even just to email some people that you know who might be interested, even in your team and the people that everyone knows, to tell them if you're interested in following us and keeping us, here's our Instagram link. Just make sure that people are aware of that and that they know how to find you.
Great advice. Another Reese, what are your views on Pinterest and any tips on how to increase engagement?
Ooh, I like Pinterest. I haven't used it for a while, to be fair. It's really different from other channels, but it could be useful, especially for the longer term. It's not a channel that you're getting short wins, but it's also a channel that you don't need to spend too much time on that. For example, you might want to create a Pinterest board for a campaign, for a fundraiser, for the storytelling aspect of your organization. And someone might actually visit your site after they spend like 2 years afterwards, which is quite impressive compared to other channels. So if you feel that you have the time and the content, like some ideas to create boards, definitely give it a try. I've seen some examples, but not many charities really use Pinterest.
Okay, so plenty of space there
Yeah, it's true.
to head into. Larry actually asked a really good question. I think this is a really good question. Would you use the same content across all platforms?
That's the key question.
Yeah, it's a million pound question.
Yes and no. We've got this question quite often from charities, and it's the situation where you don't want to suggest that everyone copies and pastes the same content everywhere. But obviously the lack of time is always a thing. We all have this issue. I'd say you might want to have a draft copy in mind, something that you want to say, and try to adjust that depending on the channel. For example, with Twitter, you have to be very specific in just 280 characters. So you might want to change the copy, or the tone of voice might be different from Facebook to LinkedIn, for example. So create some copy in mind of what you want to say, and maybe try to change a bit of the messaging from one channel to another.
Yeah, we kind of feel the same with that as well. We try to use different content. Again, it's that test environment as well, see what engages with what, and it's tend to find, I think, the beauty of social media is the fact that, you know, it's so many different people with so many different touch points, where
exactly,
you know, a subset of your audience could be interested in a video, where another subset could be interested in a cool fact, and another subset could be interested in an image or a GIF. There's so much fun,
that's true,
for lack of a better word, you can have out there with all the different types of content you can push out through social media as well. Just looking at the next questions here. Laura asked, what are your thoughts on paid social media posts?
Good question. I think it also depends on the channel and the objectives that you want to get out of it. I think, for example, on Facebook, if you do have even a small budget, it's definitely a good idea to give it a try, because it helps you reach the people that could be your potential supporters or a new audience. But it's, again, coming to test and learn. It doesn't work for everyone, and it does need some time to try to understand what you want to get out of this. Mm-hmm. But I do recommend that if you want to give it a try.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is to really understand your target audience when you're doing stuff like that as well.
Because you might just use the budget and waste it without realizing it.
Just goes up smoke,
exactly,
doesn't it? I think so. If you were going to do something like that, I think it's really important to focus on, you know, and understand who your target audience is, and when you get setting that targeting criteria, to get that right, and also test that as well.
Exactly.
As we like to do, that test multiple iterations of our audience to see what works better. Next question. We've actually had a follow-up from Kylie. We are trialing Twitter and LinkedIn for our technical content, and Facebook, Instagram for more fundraising content. Do you think this sounds like a good idea?
It does sound like a good idea. And LinkedIn is also great for partnerships and the business and corporate side, and even the senior stakeholders who don't necessarily check Facebook during the day. So it does sound like a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think exactly exactly the same as what you said, to be honest. They're both great platforms for that. Next question from Kate. Is it better to do a paid advert on Facebook or boost a post?
Good question. I was actually writing a blog post about that. I'm happy to share that, but except for that, because it's quite common as a question. It's easier to boost a post because you just see there, and Facebook is recommending that this is an easy way to boost a post and reach more people. But I'd say if you want to give it a try and actually use the budget more effectively, or even try different experiments, then actually creating an ad has more options in terms of targeting. You can play around even more with the objectives, and it gives you a good thinking of how Facebook ads and paid posts work if you want to use that experience for other ideas in the future in campaigns.
Great. So let's see if we've got any more questions coming. I actually have one here. So there's obviously a lot of organizations out there who might have multiple groups. Is there such a thing as having too many? And what sets that criteria?
I don't think there is a limit from Facebook on the number of groups. I'm pretty sure there are many charities that I've seen that have several groups. The only thing that you need to consider is the time on monitoring them. So if you have different people keeping an eye on the groups, then feel free to create different ones. Or if it's an organization with many local communities, then that's a great idea. You can even have a supporter that you feel that you can really trust that person to be a moderator. So this is a great way to actually create the communities, but also get the help to make sure that it is safe and everything's going well.
Great. Kind of as a follow-up with that, how do groups change the way you market on your social media pages?
That's a big question. I think it does change the idea of social media and the way we think of that. But when you actually have Mark Zuckerberg a few months ago telling you create more private spaces, you can't really go public anymore thinking of the future, I guess. Yeah. I think it's just the idea that a Facebook page is quite broad and it's still good to have it. But then people are not interested in the same things. They're not at the same stage. So someone who just followed your page and someone who's your most loyal supporter are still seeing the same things. So if you create Facebook groups that are different and with different uses and interests, then you might have more engagement and more success in everything that you want to really achieve.
Great. Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
The last question from Reese. I think it's more of a personal Lightful question. What would be the main benefit of trying out Lightful as a platform? Is this an additional social media platform such as Facebook or Instagram, or does it work in conjunction with them? It might be good just to explain what Lightful is a little bit.
So Lightful is a social media platform. In case you've used any platform in the past, it's sort of like Buffer and Hootsuite, but just made for charities. So it's really simple. It also has a free plan for small charities if you don't have many people being part of that. And the idea is we've made that to help more charities understand social media and not be lost around too many things and too many features. If you want to just schedule your posts and save time, for example, on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or if you want to tell a story, to have a starting point, some templates, how can you really plan a campaign? And just getting the idea of being more strategic on social media without being an expert or just having a big team to help you on that. So yeah, you can have a free trial and I'm happy to help more if you want.
Great. And we'll send some stuff out in the
course.
resources about that as well. That's all our questions. Thank you for submitting them.
Thanks, everyone.
And that's all from us here at Charity Digital and Lightful. Huge thank you once again to Teresa for joining us today. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us again, and keep cool out there. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar along with some additional resources, the slides, the video, and other previous Lightful webinars you can get via email in the next week or so. We'll also be uploading this recording to the Charity Digital News website as well. Feel free to go rewatch, share it with your colleagues whenever you want. If you'd be so kind, please don't forget to fill in our feedback form that we send out right after the recordings, the webinar's finished. It's a quick 2-minute survey, and it really does go a long way to helping us continuously improve our webinar service, and it really helps us bring the best possible webinar content we can to you. Our next webinar coming up is with digital experience company Acquia, and that will give some top tips and insights on how we can drive more donations by getting to know your audience. Again, you can go and sign up for that at the Charity Digital News website now. That's charitydigitalnews.co.uk/webinar. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.